Okay, well, while this is warming up, I'll get the apologies out of the way. As some of you will be able to hear, I've had a bit of a cough since I've been here, so I have an unpleasantly croaky presentation this afternoon, and I may do some unseemly coughing, in fact, so sorry about that. I have an incentive. I'm not very good at being brief, but I do have an incentive because apart from Jonathan's ferocity, which is that I've realised that my computer's about to run out of battery, but about halfway through. So I'm going to get the kind of pretty slides out of the way first, and the rest are probably unnecessary. Let us see. So my title, is the best thing about the paper. It's an obvious nod, so to speak, an homage in the direction, first of all, of hacking social construction of what. Hacking was not somebody I'm going to refer to very directly in this paper, but a major influence on Erickson, who in turn has been a huge influence on me. So I think that's, in a way, reason enough. I also quite like there's a joke. It's actually a joke by Bruno Latour. I've never met him. He sounds like quite a character. Anyway, but he made this joke. He said there are only 4 problems with actor-network theory. Actor, network, theory, and the hyphen. So it's quite similarly, I think there are 4 problems with the term evidence-based policy. Evidence-based and policy and the hyphen. The one I don't think I can talk about all. I can't. The purport of the title of the paper is that I think in relation to evidence-based policy and more broadly, as witness this event and really every paper that we've had, there's a good deal of discussion about what constitutes evidence, and there are many propositions and assertions by proponents of evidence-based policy that they know exactly what constitutes proper evidence, and that they have a fairly precise and sometimes quite restrictive definition of what counts as evidence. There is even some discussion here and there, not so much in criminology, which is my interest, but for example, in the philosophy of education and certainly in the medical field about what based means, right? So what does it mean to base a policy in evidence? Does it mean that your policy is mandated by the evidence in such a way that there is only one proper conclusion from a body of evidence such that any rational person must do exactly that thing? Or does it mean that the policy is in some way warranted by or is minimally consistent with a body of evidence that it doesn't violate, or whatever it does mean to base one's policy in evidence is discussed. What advocates of evidence-based policy tend not to talk about in quite the same way, I'm going to suggest, as policy, and that's the purpose of the title. Now, the title, as you will see, is a question. It stays a question throughout. I don't have an answer to the question, but I do have a series of other questions towards the end which maybe frame the issue, I think, somewhat helpfully as a kind of agenda for research anyway. Now, it makes perfect sense in the context of a symposium dedicated to the memory of Richard Erickson that we should be discussing questions about the relationship between evidence and action. That's a central concern of his. I was going to cite exactly the same paper that Tom was mentioning just at the end there, the Erickson's 2005 British Journal of Sociology paper, responding to Burawoy's for public sociology argument, in which Erickson makes it clear that he refers in that paper, and in a 2003 paper, in the 2003 paper, to criminology, in this case, as being both an academic field, a legal field, and a policy field, indicating quite clearly that he sees an integral relationship between the formulation of these various bodies of knowledge and action, but what he never says is that there is somehow one royal road to influence in the world or relationship to relating the formulation of specialist knowledges to action, but that rather there are many kinds of knowledge claim which have been activated within different regimes of government and institutions and so on, many examples of which we've seen throughout the course of the symposium. So the whole issues around the medicalisation of prisons, the introduction of the psychiatric and psychological disciplines into prisons and other correctional institutions. All of these questions are examples of the filtration of expert discourses into practices that eventuate in the kinds of things that Pat in one context and Jonathan in another both called technologies, but none of that is necessarily what is meant by evidence in the context of the evidence-based policy movement. So we have a peculiarity, I think, that we live in a world where essentially everybody agrees on the value and importance of evidence. It's quite difficult to imagine a modern human who doesn't. When Hume said in the middle of the 18th century that a rational person is one who conforms their behaviour to the evidence before them, he was articulating, I think, what has become to a very large extent the common position of most of us for most purposes, even though we're often not very good at it. So we have a sort of widespread consensus that this is something really important and fundamental to the relationship between knowledge and conduct. At the same time, of course, we have a woman who aspires to be the President of the United States who believes that the HPV vaccine causes mental retardation because somebody said so at a rally that she was giving. And that became her evidence base for that particular scare story. However, so why then, in this circumstance where we have these very long histories of social scientific cataloguing and amassing and collation of a whole variety of different forms of evidence, is there a movement, a specific movement for, quotes, evidence-based policy? Why is that a movement? Why now? And what in particular is it after, I think, and what should we make of it? Is there some kind of important relationship beyond the obvious relationship between the appearance of this movement and, on the other hand, the heating of the policy climate in which crime policy, amongst other versions of social policy, are debated, so that there's a kind of the movement itself constitutes a kind of dialectical counter-reaction to that? Is it a response to that very... Ooh, it's just me. Hotness of the criminal question in the present circumstances. Now, various people, Larry Sherman, who one would presumably think was an important speaker on behalf of the evidence-based policy movement, says exactly that his position on this is, as he puts it, that it relates to the significance of carving out a space for the deliberation of evidence in an environment, in a field which, as he puts it, is overwhelmingly decided politically. So the point there, I think, is that it places the evidence-based policy movement always in a kind of defensive or oppositional position vis-à-vis a presumed surrounding irrationality, rather than saying this is experimental criminology or evidence-based policy making is a dominant position. It presents itself strongly as a kind of oppositional and minority one, perhaps with good reason, but that's something to which we should return. Now, that's Loder. He's not here. Normally at this point, he and I published a little book last year called Public Criminology ? Normally at this point, when I speak and he's not there, I say, now, if you don't like the paper, you know who to blame. But since I haven't cleared the paper with him on this occasion, I've only got myself to blame. So, what's this about? I have a rather simple-minded graphic. There's no numbers in it, but it is an attempt to represent visually the particular nexus of things that I think provides the sense, a way in which to start to make sense of the evidence-based policy movement as a movement. And this is my... I continue to use this slide not because it is a brilliantly insightful representation of the kind of game space of criminological knowledge politics, but just because it's the best animated slide I've ever created. So, here we have three kinds of things that, in some way or another, condition the circumstances in which arguments about criminological evidence and their relation to policy arise these days, I suggest. That there are, you know, these distinct but clearly related conditions amongst which we move. And under certain circumstances or for certain kind of problematizations of things, it is possible, I suggest, for at least two of these things, the populist politics and the risk technologies, to trump the others. Like that. To overwhelm them. But more normally, the circumstance, the point, I think, is really that when we are discussing these matters about how evidence is made and what we use it for and where we live, it's usually in and amongst the kind of confluence of those influences in one way or another. And that makes it interesting, but it makes it interesting in a sense in thinking about evidence-based policy because it has such a particular sense of what evidence counts and what evidence is for that is in various ways restrictive in the sense it can only see these other influences, I would suggest, as distortions, as noise, as kind of intrusions upon its particular kind of way of carving up the knowledge system, that it wants to define evidence down to a very large extent to a specific set of discoveries or observations, often in ways that can be instrumental, classically, indeed always, I think in terms of evidence-based policy as such, in ways that can be instrumentalised for immediate application against some particular identifiable strip of conduct, which has a bearing on whatever you think policy is then going to be. And I think it comes in that kind of relationship. So very often, the various of the things that we were hearing about this morning, cognitive behavioural therapies in prisons, for example, would lay claim to be one part of the evidence-based policy movement. One very interesting thing about cognitive behavioural programs in prisons is that not only that they can be instrumentalised and packaged, but also therefore commodified, so that those programs are saleable products that can be replicated anywhere in the world, which I think is an interesting point. Therefore, and this goes back to the Erickson's 2003 and 2005 arguments, we are talking about a conception of policy as coordinated or driven or animated by evidence, which must refer to forms of expertise rather than other kinds of political coordination or intervention, primarily. So even things of the kind that Jonathan was talking about in his paper, instances of judicial policy making based on masses of evidence, carefully coordinated empirical evidence, doesn't count, I don't think, as evidence-based policy making in the classic sense, or it's not what is meant or intended by evidence-based policy making, properly so called, so to speak. Now, at this point, I was going to reprise briefly the argument of the book that Ian and I wrote last year, but I don't have time, so I'm going to embarrassingly skip through a bunch of slides about public criminology, but I'm going to leave them there for 2 seconds because they contain a series of questions which I think are relevant. That's the cover. Who knows what that is? It's a fresco, 14th century fresco by Lorenzetti, which you can see on the walls of the Palazzo Pubblico in Siena. And it's called An Allegory of Good Government. So this was the subject matter of our book, and that's hence, whereas the publishers wanted us to have pictures of riot police standing behind their shields, kind of looking at, or from their point of view, looking across at demonstrators and so on and so forth, we thought we'd stick with an image of serenity and rationality. That's the kind of people we are. Anyway, so it asks various questions which I'm not going to go into, that it tries to sketch, anyway, a particular kind of history from a particular point of view, a particular story, about the place of the development of criminological knowledge in particular, in terms not of the textbook succession of fields or schools, but rather the kind of personae who have involved themselves and the stances and positions from which they have done these things in terms of their networks and relationships and social positions. And from there to ask a series of questions about the kinds of knowledge claims and forms of expertise that have been involved in the formation of contemporary academic knowledge about and policy knowledge about crime and punishment, and those which have not. So there are certain kinds of discourse which have been channeled out in the process of these competitions, just as there are ones that have assumed more dominant roles. And in the course of that book, we therefore, the way in which we think it's appropriate to try to describe this is as a series of conversations amongst these personae rather than lists of positions. So we conduct, we script, and therefore cheat in conducting a conversation amongst 6 of these personae, and you can tell which one, this is rather like the Burawoy problem, which one we favour. But nevertheless, it is absolutely explicit and integral to the nature of the book that we want to give each of the others a proper kind of hermeneutically justified account of a best case interpretation of what it is that they think they're doing when they do criminology. And we did that because we think it's preferable to this, which is what Tom referred to at the end of their paper, which seems to be static as well as limiting in the sense in which it construes the field, and which I think just also suggests that the best way of carving up or thinking about the divisions within a particular field of study are as distinctions amongst sociologies rather than what we're trying to do, thinking about them as possible positions within what Bourdieu calls a space of positions, something that has certain kinds of rules and constraints, but which nevertheless allows a certain amount of mobility and a kind of tactical discretion to the people who are playing within that space. So, where does this leave us? We have a very lovely quote here from Cohen, which I think way back in 81 summarised in 8 lines the things that we've just written this whole book about very concisely, which is also consistent very much, I think, with the kind of position that Erickson adopts in those 2003 and 2005 papers. So, what I think is important here to have in mind is that the kind of simplification or instrumentalization which I'm saying is characteristic of certain contemporary forms of, quotes, evidence-based policy which present themselves as such as part of the explicit movement, is that there's a kind of forgetting, denial perhaps, of the very many ways in which social sciences have defined their roles in relation to practical affairs previously. In many respects, I think this is or ought to be, social policy 101, that these various formulations of those versions of the politics of knowledge exist in the historical record as part of our tradition, so to speak, but they're not activated in the kind of current evidence-based policy debate. So, Durkheim, in Professional Ethics and Civic Morals, has a great deal to say about the public responsibilities of intellectuals in general and sociologists in particular, not merely as one who, quote, studies the travails of modernity, but as an inherent part of devising ways of coping more intelligently with its consequences. So I think that those who fail to kind of recognise that part of Durkheim's work and still see him as, in some sense, an unreconstructed positivist who is also a sort of simple-minded teleological functionalist, just don't get it, as far as but lots of recent work on Durkheim, for example, Brian Turner's introduction to the recent edition of Professional Ethics, very much does. But if you consider in passing these other ways of construing the evidence-policy relationship, Lasswell regarded the social sciences at their best as what he called the sciences of democracy, which is, a position not a million miles removed from the current evidence-based policy debate, but was focused on coordinating attention. As he put it, Lasswell expressed the independence between knowledge of and in policy by defining the policy analyst's operational task as focusing the attention of all those involved in policy making so as to bring about the maximum rationality. But also, he was committed to not just to scientific studies of democracy, but to democratizing social science. So he saw the sciences of democracy as ways of promoting democratic deliberation and engagement. He experimented in various forms of deliberative polling and decision-making. He had a plan for what he called social planetaria, in which people could be actively engaged in the process of kind of lifelong and continuing self-education. And interestingly, I think, for the most part, when we think about these formulations of the evidence-conduct relationship, they have expressed a certain kind of declining epistemological self-confidence over the course of the 20th century, I would say. So Lasswell's position, although I think extremely progressive in the ways in which I've just described it, did have a rather robust sense that the knowledge that would be produced had attained a certain level of certainty and conviction. Lindblom, in his famous 1959 paper on muddling through, offers a more modest version of the capabilities of social science in an environment of what he calls incrementalism and quotes polyarchic competition. There being no centre, no mega actor, no single kind of point of coordination of policy processes, as he saw it. There can be no one decisive knowledge intervention, no killer fact, no silver bullet in any respect of any of them. But this hardly argued, in his view, for their lack of importance. The very point is that the complexity of these processes of arriving at decisions was what required their reflexive examination. And Schoen famously distinguishes between what he called a high, hard ground from which the policymaker might survey the scene and look about him with a certain kind of sense of certainty, with where things actually happen, which is what he called the swampy lowland, from which the point of view was much less elevated and where choices were always particularly difficult. So, Schoen argued, in conditions of complexity and instability, the key capability that needs to be cultivated was not knowing but learning, understood by him as an ability to adapt to transformations in the environment. Wayne Parsons, who is an English political scientist who's written quite a bit about this, said, "Public policy in Schoen's sense is really the study of how societies learn or fail to learn about those problems they define as being public and how they seek to solve or fail to solve their problems." So how do these very basic things that any social policy student knows about the relationship between knowledge and policy actions relate to what's currently claimed in the evidence-based policy movement? Well, I'd like to refer you here to a kind of high watermark in the development of these things in the United Kingdom, which was a speech given by David Blunkett, who was then Secretary of State for Education, to the Economic and Social Research Council in 2000. And the speech was called Influence or Irrelevance, Can Social Science Improve Government? And Mr. Blunkett said, tell us what works and why. He went on to say, it is self-evident that decisions on government policy ought to be informed by sound evidence. And what policymakers require is, quotes, to be able to measure the size of the effect of A on B. This is genuine social science. And reliable answers can only be reached if the best social scientists are willing to engage in this endeavour. So this was a direct, pre-Tardian, pre-Durkheimian, pre-Ketelean call, a demand for explicit, instrumentally applicable knowledge, things that can, as Parsons again put it, be added up, joined up, and wired up. Now, there have been at least two critical lines of response to evidence-based policy making in criminal justice, I think. The first says, this never really happened. For all the reasons stated or kind of observed in the slide that shows you that everything's got hot, and the one that shows the bouncing balls overwhelming each other, they were not serious. There was a kind of empty rhetorical quality to the Blunkett's call for, this is the line I'm citing, I think it belongs to people like Tim Hope and Rhys Walters, who've written critically about this kind of thing. So evidence-based policy making is in this sense more rhetoric than practice, a scientific cloak for a thinly disguised series of political preferences. The second says something like, yes, it happened, but its instrumentalism and its association with the proliferation of governmental surveillance systems, audit trails, performance units, delivery metrics, etc., make evidence-based policy making inherently tied to a command and control logic of knowledge production and use. So, but conversely, of course, there are social scientists for whom, Sherman, I cited others, it's actually an item of deeply held conviction and not merely a kind of managerialist convenience. Now, I think the point I'm trying to get at, this is for Janet, because it relates to the sort of how these conceptions of evidence-based policy making become particularly important and sometimes even compulsory under certain kinds of governmental research assessment regimes. For example, in the current research excellence framework that we're about to undergo in the UK, a proportion of all research funding that will be dispersed to universities following the assessment in 2014 will be based upon an assessment of the impact that that research unit has made on practical affairs, however defined. And there's a high level of neurosis circulating in the British Academy right now about all the ways in which to demonstrate and prove the impactfulness of your work, right? But more importantly, I think, more importantly for me, is to try to ask questions about all of this, which says which versions of the societal uses of social science are, quote, sociologically plausible. Now, I think that it's no surprise to anybody here, nor any reader of Richard Erickson's work, that one way of going about thinking about that is to refer to social studies of natural science and to attempt to translate at least some of their observations to the social sciences to a greater extent than I think has often been undertaken. And so what my bouncing balls were trying to graphically illustrate, I think, was some kind of social scientific version of the paradox formulated by the German sociology of science, Peter Weingart, who says that the scientization of society produces a politicization of the science. I think that's an important observation, but I don't have time to go into it. And similarly, where Grundmann and Stehr's already been referred to, who say, well, if we're speaking about knowledge societies, we cannot remain silent about knowledge politics. One of the interesting things about this, which I think is a kind of, again, suggests a level of reflexivity and also a kind of democratic impulse on the part of some natural scientists, which is not always matched by their social scientific colleagues, is the amount of attention that has been attributed in science policy to shifting from a deficit conception of people's relation to scientific fields of knowledge. In other words, if you knew more about X, you wouldn't oppose it to the extent that you do. If only you knew more about genetic modification of crops, you wouldn't oppose it, and so on and so forth. To one that involves higher aspirations towards more dialogic framing of science policy, using various more or less experimental modes of participation, what Brian Wynne calls upstream public engagement. Whether we are equally ready, and whether certainly the evidence-based policy movement has anything to say about public engagement with social science, I think is a more moot point that we might want to discuss. So, what does all this have to do with evidence and policy on crime? It argues for what many people here are involved in and what we think public criminology was meant to be a contribution to, namely a situated sociology, as I call it here, of the framing of penal and criminological questions, including the uses, applications, translations, representations, technical and policy implications, ethical choices and exclusions involved in particular ways of knowing about problems and solutions. It may be, if we think about it in quite those ways, then some of the current, so to speak, big picture interpretations of the state of the criminological, penological world don't look as plausible as they initially might. So the kind of big stories about the drift and direction of policy change as told by Loïc Facon, for example, in which, you know, a tide of populism engulfs knowledge, heat consumes reason, and globalization floods the world with a certain kind of sameness, are trying to explain too much and leaving too little space for other kinds of intervention. Tonry dismisses these as, quotes, amorphous and overgeneralized notions, and insists that the antidotes to penal excess are professionalized as opposed to politicized criminal justice systems and the insulation of expertise and controversy. Now, I think, and this is where in a way, I would like the evidence-based policy debate to go and to think a little bit more about policy, is to say, I don't think that insulationism, and it's part of the argument of the book, Public Criminology too, that insulationism in that sense is not now and has been known not to be a solution for at least the last 50 years. And thinking about alternatives to mere insulation, which nevertheless do create space for deliberation and the rational use of evidence, is part of our current problem, I suggest. So, I'm going to stop.
So technically, this whole conference is supposed to end in 3 minutes. I think we should take at least that much time to talk about these papers and maybe a few minutes more. So let me open it up for questions about this paper, comments, or attempts to link the papers. There's a rich connection between the two. Please.
I'm curious, in medicine, evidence-based medicine is a very celebrated concept.
Yeah.
What do you think the reason is such that evidence-based policy is so encouraged in one field and so debated in another field?
Well, I think partly for the reason that Erickson referred to, that the criminal justice field is moral, is cultural, is full of images, narratives, representations, all of these things which can't be drained out of it. So there's a way in which certain of the cruder versions of evidence-based policy making in criminal justice, say, want to. There's a kind of optimism it might even be a fantasy, that you can kind of purge those things out of it sufficiently to kind of have that kind of separate, entirely lucid conversation. Now, I think you can approximate those things within certain professional spheres, maybe, but how that relates to the wider question of how decisions are to be deliberated publicly in criminal justice is a bit of a different question from issues, many medical issues, but even then, there are many medical policy issues of a more macro nature that don't have those characteristics either. But it's very interesting to see that Lawrence Sherman, for example, has in the UK there's an institution called the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, which has for the last several years made decisions about which treatments are to be licensed for use in the National Health Service and which not, and it does that on grounds of clinical effectiveness and cost. And Sherman says there should be a National Institute for Criminal Justice Excellence, which does exactly the same thing with crime policy. Right? And so to say that a particular, and this term is also used, that a particular innovation justified by experimental, in his case, experimental research, is like a dose. There is something that is comparable to a dosage of a medication. That, it seems to me, is a thin, and not even a disguised metaphor, it's just a metaphor for a certain, a certain kind of analogy between some sort of social action in relation to police behaviour or prison sentencing or prison treatment programmes also, and a medicine. I think the analogy breaks down quite rapidly, so that it's much more difficult really to see what range of the kinds of problems that are covered by criminal justice systems can be likened to the problems that arise in deciding which medical treatments are going to be administered in the National Health Service.
So we're right, Janet.
Richard, I just want to pick up on the impact issue, because in the last version of ERA, which was called the RQF, was going to look at impact. And of course there were a lot of controversy about that if you had been a critical researcher or political scientist, you'd be writing things that have absolutely no impact on policy, because people are not just they're not going to take it on board. So do you have the same debate there?
Yes, we do, very much. I mean, there are several problems. One is just a disciplinary question. So, it's much easier for, people in certain applied hard sciences to demonstrate impact if what you're doing is working on improved technology for some important social use than for most other people. If you work in agricultural chemicals, I think you can show impact quite easily. If, on the other hand, you work in museum studies, yes, there is a certain kind of public engagement aspect to that, but certain kinds of humanities in particular are very worried about the impact criterion also applying to them. What it does mean is that people become more inventive, though, about, and there's several things people become inventive about impact claims and how to present them. So it's a reflexive process. So that there is that dimension, and secondly, that over time the criterion tends to soften, so that when the impact requirement was first sort of articulated, it looked like, unless you'd picked up some knowledge in a bucket and dumped it over the head of a policymaker and they changed what they did as a result, you couldn't claim impact. Whereas it's not quite like that in the way in which it's actually going to be kind of reported or evaluated, and it is going to be evaluated mainly by peers. So I'm not as scared of the impact requirement as I was, and I even think that if you believe in public responsibilities of social scientists and other academics, it's not a self-evidently ridiculous thing to want to pay some attention to. But what I think is important is that to the extent that the criterion softens, it also kind of broadens in terms of with whom your impact can take place. So Whereas initially people say, oh, this has got to be about central government policymakers. Actually, it could be something that occurs at a much more local level. It could be something that occurs in a relationship with a civil society organisation, a campaigning group, and so on and so forth. So I think that, you know, provided social scientists and other academics mobilise to say, this is what seems to us to be an acceptable account of the kinds of impacts to which we aspire, you can probably arrive at a point at which you could live with it.
What if you have a bad impact?
Yeah, we've been discussing that actually, because I think there is at least one very senior member of my faculty who was intimately involved in the design of the trial of Abdul Basit al-Megrahi for the bombing in Scotland in whatever it was, the Lockerbie bombing. We won't be entering.
Is that right?
Just as a follow-up to that, in 2004, before that Borovoy article, there was another one in the British Journal of Sociology that created a lot of debate. It was by Lauder, I think, and Halsey.
And Brown.
Person. Yes. And then it talks about how sociology has to become a new political arithmetic and sort of become this policy.
Political arithmetic. It's very, very.
Yes, and then it talks about how, you know, in a democratic society, sociology should strive to become relevant to policy, but it should first become rigorous, and the methods should become this, and the questions should become that. And then it seems like because the relationship between research and policy is very tenuous at best, what happens, the concrete outcome of this is that sociology itself changes. They might or might not change policy, but sociology changes in the sense that you're always pushed towards these, you know, certain methods, and what is rigorousness will always you know, be objective. And
so that's an important thing, isn't it? Because do you want a situation in which social scientists behave on the basis of a kind of unrequited crush on policymakers? And that would be a tricky situation to justify, I think. On the other hand, you know, I think one of the implications, but I do maintain, and if you could go back to the several of the papers, I was thinking this during Bob and Dorothy's paper this morning about, you know, the role of the side disciplines. Well, that was by no means, you know, it is by no means the case that the impact of social science research on social practices is always benign or always as intended. It may be all kinds of things. It may be, you know, in all sorts of ways problematic, but if we're serious about these questions, we cannot deny that there are expert knowledges being mobilised throughout, and the kind of filtration of those kinds of knowledges into practice might be much more subtle, long-term, unpredictable, and ambiguous than the evidence-based policy movement thinks, but it's clearly there. However, I think that was a particularly, that's a strange, it's an exact, the Halsey et al. Paper, I think, was an example of what Loder and I in our book following Bauman called legislative utterances, that you know, there are certain ways in which we are told at particular junctures in the development of disciplines that we must do such and such, you know, that we must all do this actually, and that it is proper and that can be calls to a certain kind of somewhat. I'm trying to avoid using the word reactionary. To a certain kind of, maybe slightly out of time orthodoxy. But it may also be a critical, and maybe also a critical response. So, for example, I referred to this paper by Walters, which is explaining why he was calling on criminologists in Britain to boycott government funding because of the various ways in which, as he saw it, this is part of the unrequited crush, I think. There was so disappointed was he by the behaviour of some government researchers in response to previous published work by him and others that he thought we should not do that anymore. So there's a kind of sense of, you build up a next set of expectations in a relationship. The other partner in the relationship lets you down. You're pissed off, right?
Yeah.
So that was, I think, part and parcel of that reaction, which was kind of that of a disappointed lover. In a certain sense.
And I suspect that our discussion could go on, but let me ask you first to join me in thanking Zoira and Tom and Richard for these great papers.